Michael Oliver, who was Lord Mayor of London in this particular year, is an old friend of mine. And he told me how of his ambition to raise a lot of money during his term in office for what he called the Square Smile appeal. And it was a tremendously worthy cause. Money going to charities which dealt in cancer, establishing a cancer new research unit at St Bart's, and other charities of a similar ilk. And I wanted to do what I could to help him. And he suggested putting on a show of some sort. Well, I mean, the first thing that springs to mind is a rock concert, but that really wasn't feasible in the City of London. And I'd done enough rock concerts in my life to decide I didn't want to do another one. And so he asked me if I could come up with an idea. And poor old Spike Milligan died a few months before all this happened. And I said, well, he was such a great icon in British entertainment history. I mean, he actually started a completely new trend in humour, that I thought it'd be a good idea to put on a tribute concert to him. And I knew there were a lot of people in the entertainment world who would be happy to join me in this. And that was how it all started.
Yes, we were quite surprised when we were asked to do the Spike Milligan tribute, because I think none of us had quite realised how much we were expected to do. We didn't realise we were going to have to sort of actually reenact Spike material, actually sort of impersonate the Goons and things, until we were actually there on the stage. And George Martin said, well, I'd really like you to do this and that. I thought I was just coming along to actually just sort of pay a little tribute to Spike. So it was a bit of a surprise finding ourselves playing the parts of our childhood heroes.
Our show was called I Told You I Was Ill, Spike Milligan's Great Epitaph. And it's interesting because, of course, it is a classic British joke. And that is that there's the wonderful thought that some idiot is going to say, oh, did he say he was ill before he died? And it's the hope that there'll be something like that said that gives the British humour its sort of afterburn quality that people like.
I think Britain had a problem with Spike Milligan because they thought, hang on, this man was born in India. He was in the army, you know. He should be rather serious, and he's behaving. He's making the Monty Python young people, or the young ones, look pensionable and rather staid.
I think Spike pushed the boundaries out, basically. You know, it's kind of stodgy post-war Britain where there were just jokes about potatoes and having trouble with your motor car. He came along and, you know, people started hurling batter puddings, and that was a good move forward.
I listened to The Goon Show in a big vicarage in Oxfordshire. We were not allowed, of course, the television, and television had hardly come into people's homes. But The Goon Show was wonderful because it showed adults doing what I thought some adults could do really well, which was talk to kids and make them laugh. And The Goon Show did that. And, of course, it was marvellously subversive, which every sensible child is like that. So I would listen with my brother to The Goon Show with an air of absolute rapture.
Well, the first time I was aware of Spike was obviously from The Goon Show. So it was, my brother and I lying under the dining room table, giggling ourselves silly at The Goon Shows.
I think I first became aware of Spike with the Q series. I was a bit young for the Goons and had to rediscover them for myself at a later date. But there was just arch silliness that always tickled me. There was Spike standing up in dressed as Nelson, full costume, and David Rappaport, who was vertically challenged, come up to just above Spike's knee, dressed in identical same costume. Spike standing there says, "Nelson," points down, "half Nelson," which tickled me.
I came to Spike quite late, actually directly. I remember when I was a kid, my dad and my uncle would be doing voices from the Goons. And my first kind of direct contact with Spike was sort of early 70s, when I was in my early teens, when the Q series came out.
I was a Goon watcher from the age of about 6 or 7. I was born in 1946 and the show started in 51, so that makes me 5 or something. And I sort of gradually became aware of it. And it was a playground game. I mean, I think what I do recall is us doing the Blue Bottle voices and the Eccles voices in the playground at my prep school as part of the whole kind of setup of childhood. We'd taken them on board very, very fast, considering that the show was still running on the radio. And I used to, literally rush home from school, catch a bus, and also not to miss this week's Goon Show.
I didn't actually know who he was until I got to about 6 or 7, because my dad used to, he was always going, "He's falling in the water, and I just thought my dad was a bit nuts. And then I found out when I started to listen to the reruns of the Goons that it was my dad nicking those voices off him. And then, because I liked that so much, my dad used to read me his books, which was. But what he used to do was he would read through, and then when he got to a bit that was a bit rude, or he didn't want to read out, he would just kind of stop, and you'd see his eyes just kind of editing through, and then he'd be laughing to himself. And again, I just thought my dad couldn't read properly. He would just sort of read down, and then he'd start again at a suitable bit. So it wasn't until I actually kind of read the books for myself that they made any sense, because he just used to miss chunks out. Like, I can't read that to a small child.
So now I've got kids and they go to a primary school, and one of the things that's organised at the primary school is poetry competitions, and every year it's the same. People say, will it be Larkin? Will they do a bit of Shakespeare? What's it going to be? It's going to be really raise the level of the intellectual. And every year, 70-80% of them are Spike Milligan poems, because the kids just love them. And it's not as if you can say, well, they're crap. They are entertaining and they're good poems, but every year it's the same story. The kids love Spike Milligan.
I was given the job of running the Parlophone label, which had no input from America. All the other guys had people like Elvis Presley and Mitch Miller and people like that. We had nothing like that, so I had to make my own way. And I did that by going into comedy. And I met up with Peter Sellers, and I met up with Spike Milligan. And Peter and Spike and Harry were at the height of their fame with the Goons. And I got to know them very well. And in fact, I issued a Goon show on the Parlophone label.
I think my first experience of Spike Milligan was listening to cassettes of the old Goon Show episodes. I used to go up to our public library and used to be able to take out cassettes. And I remember going home and making bootleg copies. That's illegal, I don't advocate it. But making pirate copies of the tapes and listening to them and just being transfixed by the sort of surreal world that he created. But more than that, I think the sound effects. For some reason, as a kid, being utterly transfixed by the sound effects and how were they making the sound effects? Who was making them? Was there actually a battered pudding being thrown at a wall? And then from that, also going out to the public library and getting out sound effects cassettes that you could get and trying to write sketches based on the sound effects I had. I'm sure that Spike Milligan didn't start with the sound effects, wasn't sort of sat at home making weird noises in his kitchen and thinking that'll be hilarious. But I sort of started with the sound effects and then tried to write sketches. I remember writing like an 8-minute sketch based around the sound effect of some tsetse flies.
I think one of the things that comedians do is they give young people particularly attitude, and that's what young people get high on, attitude. And Spike Milligan's attitude was so wonderfully anarchic, and the idea that these people were there to be laughed at, and that was good and worth doing. And I think that affected enormously my generation particularly, that we'd had stuffy shirts, we'd had all the talk about sort of honour and pride and being neat and tidy and all those things. And Spike was wonderfully not tidy, more of a shambles, total chaos. And that was very liberating, and it affected, I think, the spirit of the 50s that was then expressed more fully in the 1960s, where all the other people then in fashion, I think, began to catch up with Spike.
Even like when you listen to the Goons now, you just sort of, just the fact that he put rude names in, and there was stuff in there which kind of, for its time, when you think about what else was on around then, it was kind of, he was just subverting everything. And then obviously when he got on telly, he started subverting that, you know, and he was breaking the rules before most people had kind of worked out what the rules were, really.
He didn't intend to be a performer. I mean, his first contribution to the Goons was chiefly as a writer. And at first he didn't write much for himself even. Pages of script go by in the early ones where there's nothing for Spike at all.
He was writing it on his own. I think he got a little bit of help here and there every now and then. But it would be week after week. He would have to come up with these half-hour scripts.
He didn't think of himself as a performer until his stage successes in the 60s, particularly Oblomov, when he improvised an entire play every night because he couldn't bother to learn his lines, and also the audience loved it. And he did that for a year or so in the West End, and he felt that was quite an achievement as a performer, and that for him was the peak of his performing career. Earlier on, he simply thought of himself as almost entirely a writer who just happened to do a few voices now and then.
I remember seeing clips of him and Seacombe and Sellers on stage reading Goon scripts, and it always impressed me just what a laugh they were having. What a fantastic laugh it was, the giggling like school lads. And I remember thinking to myself when I saw that as a kid, that wouldn't be work, would it? It wouldn't be a job. It just looked such a laugh. They obviously had a great time doing those.
Okay! Och nose, och teeth. October.
The moment that I always think of, whenever I think of Spike, I always think of, it was something on one of the radio shows, the Goon shows. It was Moriarty was saying, yeah, money talks. And Spike saying, no, I'm a threepenny bit.
My favourite Spike Milligan sketch is something from Q, and I think it sums up Spike Milligan's approach to comedy and also sort of his vision of the world, really. And it just cuts, and it's Spike sat at an easel, seemingly painting a paint-by-numbers version of the Mona Lisa. And you laugh at that because it's so absurd, and then you realise that actually what he's doing is painting the numbers on top of the Mona Lisa and making the Mona Lisa into a paint-by-numbers. And that, to me, just kind of captures the spirit of Spike, really. You can just imagine his mind looking at the Mona Lisa and coming up with that. And of all the sketches I've seen, all the TV comedy I've seen, that image just stays in my mind so vividly of Spike, probably in some floppy hat, just painting the Mona Lisa into a paint-by-numbers. Brilliant.
I remember once we made an album with him, which was a takeoff of the Bridge on the River Kwai, the famous Alec Guinness film. And it was very funny. And it had in it Peter, Spike, Peter Cook, and various other people. I remember Peter Sellers did a wonderful Alec Guinness voice. And it was one of my favourite comedy albums. I mean, it's a bizarre thing to make humour out of, but it was very good. And just at the last moment, EMI's lawyer rang me and said, you can't put this out. I said, why not? He said, because David Lean and the Bridge on the River Kwai people say you are sending up their great work, and they will put in an injunction if you try to do this. And I told Spike this, and he went mad. He said, they can't do that. I'll write to the Prime Minister, do all sorts of things. And I said, well, hang on, Spike, there may be a way around it. He said, well, how can there be? I gave it a lot of thought. I rang him back. I said, I think I've got the answer. He said, yeah. I said, let's not call it Bridge on the River Kwai. And there was a stunned silence. I said, let's call it the Bridge on the River Wye, which is in Herefordshire, W-Y-E. I said, that'll get round it, pretend it's a bridge in England. He said, well, it would work. He said, but we mention the River Kwai in the record all the time. I said, I'll cut off all the K's. So I went through this tape with a pair of brass scissors, cutting off K's at the beginning of every, so that, well, when we finish this Bridge on the River Wye, it'll be done. And it worked. And I mean, he made me as anarchic as he was himself.
The record, I think it was on the other side of I'm Walking Backwards to Christmas, possibly, which ended with Blue Bottle saying, exits through little hole in middle of record. And then on the other side of that, it was nothing at all, it said on the label. And you put the record on, and there was silence on the 78 record. Eventually you heard some footsteps coming across to the microphone, and then Milligan saying, "There's nothing on this side." I mean, really, it isn't worth listening to because there's nothing on it.
Not everything was my cup of tea, shall we say, and but certain flips of logic of Eccles, for example, particularly appealed to me. Blue Bottle appealed to me, and Grip Type Thin was absolutely my guy in the show. Whenever he came on, that was the man for me. I loved him fabulously.
Yeah, I think my favourite one was the of the Goons was when they were when they made the replica of Britain. I can just remember, you know, and they floated out. And I just remember listening to that and just kind of, just, you know, those ideas, just going, wow, that's, of course, kind of made sense, you know.
One of my favourite Goon sketches, I suppose, is exemplified by Spike playing the part of the man who's organising the memoirs of the generals, and the great cry of, "The war is over! Get to your typewriters!" I think it's sort of wonderful. It's funny, it's absurd, but it's also horribly true, because, of course, the people who write the memoirs fastest are often the ones who get their version over of what happened.
Big thing about Spike for me was that there was this work that he produced that was so joyful and exuberant, and you know, besides the comedy, there's the poetry and the charity work, so compassionate also. I've always been really impressed by the fact that he did this from a background of personal suffering. And if you sort of look at his life, there was quite a lot of suffering. Consider 6 years in the Second World War, seeing active action there, seeing and doing things that would be the stuff of our nightmares, and not much post-traumatic stress type mental health care after that.
I think what you've got to realise, I suppose, about Spike is that he had a nervous breakdown in the war, and he spent most of the time immediately after the war kind of getting over it.
He used to get the most terrible depressions, which will come upon him unawares, almost suddenly, you know, and best leave him alone in those circumstances. He just had to come out of it. But when he was out of it, he was enormous fun, and we always had jokes flying. If you were on the telephone, he'd always finish up with a joke that made me reel.
The piece that I had to do wasn't out-and-out comedy. It was from Spike's war diaries, which I'd read as a teenager and got very involved in them, because I think it was a window into Spike's soul that certainly I hadn't met before. And especially the passage that I was asked to read, where he was hit by a mortar bomb and hospitalised, which then led to a serious depression, and which troubled him for the rest of his life, really. It was the dark side of Spike Milligan, I suppose. And I spoke to his daughter after the event, who'd been understandably very moved by the whole evening, but said that was a real turning point in his life, and she was very delighted that it had been included.
The war provided a kind of subject matter for him. You can argue that the entire Goon show is a kind of poem about World War II, a landscape where things have been blitzed, and there are strange, sinister, hard-faced men who've done well out of the war, Grit Pipe Thin, and various odd refugees, Moriarty, and you've got the sort of innocent Harry Seacombe in his battle dress still wandering around the ruins. It's not a sort of war about goodies and baddies. There's no Hitler figure in it. It's not like Tolkien, for example, who you could argue creates the Lord of the Rings out of World War II. Spike's war is a funny war, and that's a wonderfully original idea. But the war was his mental playground, his landscape, his intellectual excitement. It gave him really all his ideas.
Major Bloodnock, I think, inspecting a line of troops and saying, "Oh, what's this soldier here at the end? Or what kind of guard is this covered at the end, all covered in filth and soot? What kind of a guard do you call yourself?" And Milligan saying, "Oh, I'm a mud guard."
There's always a very thin line between genius and madness, and Spike, I think, had certainly had heaps of both thrust upon him, and that was the point that led to his downside.
Quite often people become mentally stressed by the world because they're very aware and because they're very sensitive. And on top of this, when you've been out there, I think, when you've really, really suffered and your mind's been sort of just messed around by the world, it does lead to an alternative view of things.
And I guess when you question as many things as Spike questions, you might just open one door too many. Maybe that led to the depression.
I think the most important thing about Milligan, I think, is the fact that, you know, you can read into it and sort of go, you know, oh, was he deconstructing things? Was he subverting the medium and all the rest of it? And that's why he was brilliant and he was years ahead of his time. And I think the bottom line is the bloke was mental. And that's why he's so brilliant, because, you know, he was driven by his madness to create, well, just to constantly create. And, you know, you can read into it all you like. Essentially, the bloke had an amazing mind and, you know, he was just nuts. And that's what made him create such great stuff.
I think when you work in comedy, or if you write comedy, or if you have aspirations to write comedy, there's a danger the more you do it that you try to theorise it, you try to work out the logic or the tricks of the trade. And I think it's always nice to kind of be reminded of someone like Spike, who seems to do everything so instinctively. It's part of the reason perhaps that he's got so much work and some of it's hit and miss, but you just feel that he didn't try to think the rules through. He just was instinctive. He just did what he thought was funny. His gut instinct was what drove him. And I think that's why so much of it is so kind of so strikingly funny, is that he shares with people like, I think, Vic and Bob, or people like that, who just, it's in them. It's just, they can just blurt it out there and they just throw it at the wall, almost like an artist who's just splashing paint on a canvas, you know. And he was just the king of that, I think, just a master of that.
Spike was the grandfather of British comedy, and he created the Goons. Without him, the Goons would not have happened. And Peter Sellers and Harry Seacombe would not have become what they did become. And without the Goons, I doubt whether we would have had Monty Python in the way that it was. And without Monty Python, we probably wouldn't have had the brand of humour that has influenced so many of our current people, like Paul Merton and Eddie Izzard and so on. So he is the kind of originator of it all.
As a performer and as a writer, I think he's simply, for my money, he's the funniest person ever. Nobody wrote anything funnier than The Goon Show. Nobody is funnier than Spike performing on top form, which happened quite a lot, really. Nobody makes me laugh as much.
And quite often with Spike, you can find yourself laughing and not quite knowing why. Or laughing and knowing why and going, how dare you do that juxtaposition of logic and reality, and plain silliness has always made me laugh with his stuff.
Now, the brilliant thing about him was that he didn't edit himself. He had no fear with his comedy. He would try anything, and sometimes it wouldn't work, but when it did, it was fantastic.
I think Spike Milligan was one of the great cult figures of comedy, but of course, like all great cult figures, he had an enormous following. He was a great comedian.
He was the first comedian, if only for a few years, that I think I was truly obsessed with. And the first comedian to make me think, comedy? Oh, I wouldn't mind having a go at that. That looks like fun.
Spike was a genius, in my humble opinion. We're unique as mammals in that we're the only mammals who attempt to make each other laugh and put a great deal of effort into it. And Spike just had he was a unique mammal in that respect.
I miss him very much. He was a dear friend.
I remember thinking throughout the 80s, I don't know why, it always seemed a great shame to me that Spike Milligan never received a knighthood. It seemed like celebrities were being given knighthoods, you know, left, right and centre, but he never seemed to. And people used to say, oh,
What
well...
are you doing?
Eh?
What are you doing?
I'm just doing an interview about Spike Milligan.
Oh, I don't think I'd want to hear the opinions of a comedian or...
Well, I'm not doing it behind your back.
Oh, it's funny. I just popped in and then...
Do you want to come and talk about Spike Milligan? Well then.
Oh. So that is?
What is that?
Fan man.
Yeah.
Right, what do you want to know?
Oh. Well.
Brilliant.
All
the Goons, really.
No, I was just saying that...
look, he's falling in the water.
I was just trying to say that I think it was a great shame that Spike Milligan did. That was Harry Seacombe.
All Goons.
Should we Just saying
A
that.
berm? What do you mean a berm?
I don't know what that is.